Welcome, everybody, to Flat Earth Nation. It is a Flat Earth Nation. Don't let them tell you anything else unless they're willing to debate you in a fair and honest way, my new ex normal. Let's see where we can go with that. I am going to treat it like there's people already here, but I do want to wait to read what I've written down until I know there are a few. It's going to be about, you know, the continuation of World War II. And since I don't believe in atomic weapons or even quantum physics that, required that math to make the nuclear bomb, thank you very much, Einstein. I don't believe that he was a great help to the world either. But I do know they set this up still going on today. So we might look at a little bit of, you know, crisis in America, this type of stuff. This is what they were putting out.
In Tito's supposed non-Soviet communist neutral Yugoslavia, this student wrote, and Khrushchev said, quote, "In this world today, there is a fierce struggle of two ideologies, the socialist and the bourgeois. And in this struggle, there can be no neutrals."
Wow, imagine if they had to do that wearing a mask. Hopefully I was sharing that. So imagine that. Welcome. I sneaked a peek and saw that it was Luther the Truther is in the house. I want to, bring it back here to Texas. It's all about Texas. It seems like with the John Birch Society, JFK assassination, that was one of the most important false flag big deals setups, a part of their rewritten history that, they still can't release all the information, but we got speculators. I'm interpreting it as it's all about Texas.
Where they were located and that they had trained in Red Rock, Colorado. Now, Mackenzie goes back and forth to the bathroom, writing down these names, stuffing in his pockets. He's got his pants back on by this time, by the way. Various scraps of paper. I don't forget anything. Yes.
A lot of people make a living talking about JFK and everything. Everybody's found what, this is, what do you do for a living? Well, normally I talk about JFK.
Yes. And records these names in a memoir many years later called The Men That Don't Fit In. And you can go on to Amazon, buy a copy of it, and read it for yourself. Several weeks after the assassination, Mackenzie flees the country, probably saving his life. Now, I want to make this real clear right here and right now. This is not Rod Mackenzie's story. This is Malcolm Wallace's story. So we're going to take a good look and see what Malcolm Wallace has to say. Now, I covered Malcolm Wallace last time. We got a bunch of new people, so we're going to go over his background again. Malcolm Wallace was Lyndon Johnson's personal hitman. He was a Texas native, and he was a real lantern-jawed tough.
And you know something? LBJ needed his own hitman. So, we might get into that. I just wanted to show you this. Get us out of the United Nations and let you know that when my wife was going to high school or grade school, her dad's main mode of transportation back and forth to church and work and everything was an used checkered cab that had a sign that said, "Keep us out of the United Nations, join the John Birch Society." This has been a part of what's going on for a while. So basically I wanted to, right now, Skull Asylum, Luther, what really is normal? They say we got to adjust to a new normal. Like everybody thinks their own life is normal right now, but normal compared to what? Do you dress like the people in China? We'll see what I covered here. I wrote a few pages, and then we'll get into just a few more connections to the John Birch legend and how it fits into the communist nationalist situation that's going on in China today with Taiwan. Tell me one thing about the normal life. How would we know if our own lives are normal? Compare. Reflect from your most comfortable resting position. I normally drink coffee in a cup. Most drink it in the morning. For whatever reason, coffee hits the spot for many people in many ways, never a normal pattern. At that time, I was thinking about somebody that one time ordered a cup of coffee. It was $16. $16 for a cup of coffee at one of these high-end places. Nothing normal but ruin. How does the first shoe drop? What is a normal place to shop? Is it still normal to dance at weddings singing Moni Moni? Does a shotgun still get it done? Was that only normal for me? Was normal made up out of whole cloth? And what does that even mean? Plus, why is it normal to wait for the second shoe to drop? I'm a dog person full time. What would a new normal disrupt for you that would change your life negatively? So now I'm committed to my new ex-normal. I guess some men fear commitment. I wonder if they are steadfast in their commitment to anything outside themselves, as normally alone with avatars as they've become. So I want to tie in the two most recent shows that I've done about Islam with tonight's show. I want to also tie in my own connection to the John Birch Society. I already did that by showing the picture, my wife's dad was one of the founding members of the church that started the homeschool movement that I met her at, worked at, and also tie in my own connection to the John Birch Society. Did the fake history of the world wars ever end? Are nations finally deceived again? Narrow road to lead me home, light of life, let me normally be thinking of ways to offer praise. I'm sure that's what I meant, but I put down thinging, T-H-I-N-G instead of T-H-I-N-K. Man, that's crazy. So anyway, first thing I've got for you tonight is, have you ever heard of the Dixie Mission? What it was, the Dixie Mission. It was something in China, that's for sure.
In 1944, China was at war with Imperial Japan and divided internally between the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong. Washington felt confident Japan would soon be defeated, but saw a civil war between the communists and the nationalists on the horizon. The nationalists had the support of the United States, but the U.S. wanted to know more about the communists, who were proving to be effective guerrilla fighters and rapidly gaining support in the countryside. The Pentagon decided to make official contact with the communists, sending a plane to their base in Yan'an. On board, a group of American soldiers and diplomats officially called the U.S. Army Observation Group, but unofficially known as the Dixie Mission, a reference to the southern states in the U.S. Civil War, since the Americans considered Yan'an, quote, rebel territory. Zhao Ma is professor of Chinese history at Washington University in St. Louis.
Their primary focus is just to understand what is going on behind the enemy lines. Along the way, they are able to even have a better sense of how communism mobilizes people.
The U.S. observers lived alongside the communists, meeting with Mao and other leaders many times. Most of the original members of the Dixie Mission stayed in Yan'an for about 6 months. A smaller group stayed through 1947. John Peyton Davies and John Service were the primary diplomatic observers. Both were born in China to missionary parents and grew up speaking Chinese. How were they received by the communists?
They show very strong interest in hosting this group of American observers And they show their willingness to work with Washington, or at least to have some kind of a good working relationship with Washington. They arranged Americans to talk to the communist military and the civil leaders.
The Dixie Mission came to a controversial conclusion. The communists would likely win the coming civil war, and the U.S. should establish ties with the CPC.
I reported on the communists after my visit there that I thought that they would probably win in China. And the reason I think that that would happen is that they had popular support.
In a letter to Washington, John Service wrote, quote, "This popular support gives the communists political power, which will make them a continuing and potent force in China. This is a fact which American policy must take into account." But back home in Washington, their recommendations ran into growing anti-communist sentiment. The Cold War between the U.S. and the Soviet Union was taking shape. The so-called Red Scare was on the horizon. Charles Ray is a retired U.S. diplomat. He was stationed in China in the 1980s.
You know, my view that mission was doomed to failure before the planes ever took off, because senior people in Washington were just basically not prepared to get in bed with, quote, communists. Those diplomats who went in with that mission came back and reported what they saw accurately and honorably. This is what we think is going to happen. And when it happened, they were blamed for it.
Not only were their recommendations ignored, several of them were blacklisted, driven out of their careers, and investigated by the FBI. John Service was arrested in 1945 over allegations he revealed his reports on China to journalists. A grand jury declined to indict him.
They were accused of the communist sympathizers. But at the same time, what they did is just tell the truth.
The communists were victorious and the People's Republic of China was established in 1949. But the U.S. had no official contact with the PRC or the Communist Party until the 1970s under U.S. President Richard Nixon.
The way this country has dealt with China through the centuries, we've always been a day late and a dollar short in figuring out who the Chinese.
They thought that they
Report gives the communists
This is
political
crazy,
power.
right? I just wanted to let this play out here for a little bit more. It just seems like, if I can find it real quick. No. Oh, like this guy here. His teeth look like they've been photoshopped. And then just a few seconds after they show this, they show this guy over here. You know, to me, that just seems like, you know, they were characterizing people. I think you know what I mean. The Dixie Mission. And you might recognize that picture from the video, but the Dixie Mission, you know, that is what John Birch was. You know, he was a missionary, son of a missionary. He was a missionary, just happened to be a Rhodes Scholar candidate who was in the military intelligence. And it was all about, he wanted to, you know, help the nationalists, not the communists. But somehow along the way, John Birch gets killed. So he's one of these people from this, you know, secret mission to try to get the nationalists and the communists to fight the Japanese, which is a fake war anyway, because, you know, the Japanese were really the only ones who, I think, were fighting. The whole war was about Japan almost took over the world. And so he was in on that. And then there was some in the CIA, they wanted to, I guess they wanted the nationalists, and the FBI, the socialists more leaning, wanted the communists. And John Birch was killed 2 weeks after the war, after Japan had surrendered, when he was still working with the nationalists and was on one final mission. And they say that, you know, they told him to, the Chinese who were supposed to be on his side, the Chinese communists told him to disarm, that's our standing orders, and he wouldn't do it. So he shot his mouth off and they killed him. That's honestly their story. But a little bit more about the Dixie Mission and that he was a part of, and get a feel for that time, that era. The United States Army Observation Group, commonly known as the Dixie Mission, was the first U.S. effort to establish official relationships with the Communist Party of China and the People's Liberation Army, then headquartered in the mountainous city of Yuan. The mission was launched on the 22nd of July, 1944, during World War II. Well, this was a long mission. It lasted until March 1947. In addition to establishing relations, the goals were to investigate the communists politically and militarily and determine if the U.S. would benefit from lasting liaison. John S. Service, that sounds like a made-up name, of the U.S. Department of State was responsible, and so they're sent there. They give a mission, update. U.S. considered military intervention. And remember, after World War II, Korean War was basically fought against these same Chinese communists who met with FDR and were propped up. And then the United States abandoned the nationalists who got pushed onto the island of Taiwan, where they are today. And it's in the news because that's why the question in the title, is this war still going on? I think it is. I think that all evidence points to it still going on, because all of this is part of Satan's nation building program after he was released, because during his 1,000-year stay in the pit, he couldn't deceive the nations any longer. See Revelation 20, verse 3. So the Dixie Mission might get a little bit more information from this, but who knows? A lot of times they just cut and paste from Wikipedia too. It says the first deep encounter of American officials with the Chinese communists came in 1944 during World War II, when a U.S. Army observer group was sent to meet with the communist leaders at its headquarters stronghold in Yunnan in North China. It was essentially an intelligence mission. So collaborated to evaluate the communist potential for military collaboration against the Japanese. So although we were, all that time with the flying tigers and flying over the hump, and John Birch had been working this intelligence angle, working with the communist nationals since 1941. He was already over there as OSS, more than likely OSS, pre-OSS, whatever they were called, intelligence officer. But he was working with Chiang Kai-shek. Here, let's read. This meant American aid and an American relationship, which was exactly what Chiang Kai-shek feared, and the reason he had done his best to obstruct the mission. The communists welcomed the contract. They were frank and open and willing to tell the Americans what they wanted to know. Not everything the Americans heard or saw was understood, but they gathered a wealth of information. I'm sure they did. So this is still what they're fighting for today. And here's where the nationalist Chiang Kai-shek ended up. And here's what the communists were given. And that's why, that started the Cold War. And it still goes on to this day. There still is the John Birch Society is active to this day. It's funded by the Koch brothers because their dad was in on founding the John Birch Society with the founder Welch, who lost China. The Dixie Mission's role was questioned. The intelligence it's produced was said to be tainted and shunted aside. Well, they got attacked a little bit later. Let's just go on and see if we can't. This is one of the guys that was involved in one of these. This is the Office of Strategic Services. This is who John Birch worked for. I just thought that guy looked like a real ruffian. Here's one of the first CIA recruitment films.
OSS officers came from all walks of life and brought interesting life experiences and unusual skills to their work. It was in many ways a dream team that would never be seen again. A few used their status to their advantage, like Hollywood director John Ford, who used his easy access to cameras to gather information for the Allied forces. Mo Berg, a professional baseball player who played for a number of teams, including the Red Sox, helped the OSS with his fluency in many European languages.
Yeah, he just happened to
Movie
be
star
gay.
Sterling Hayden took his acting to the next level to go behind enemy lines in Yugoslavia. Other OSS operatives had backgrounds ranging from academics to entertainers, to circus performers and even swimmers and safecrackers. Men and women were recruited from all over the country. OSS is remembered for having a good record for recruiting and employing women. OSS officers underwent vigorous training in guerrilla warfare and new cloak and dagger combat methods such as espionage and lethal covert action. They were also required to take a variety of subjects in the classroom. Trainees were hidden away in camps where they lived under realistic conditions in order to prepare them for the conditions they would have to endure on missions overseas. They endured strenuous physical endurance training on outdoor obstacle courses designed to target and exercise the muscles most used in combat. They learned the correct way to hold and shoot a pistol and practiced this form in front of mirrors until it was perfected. OSS trainers taught them maneuvers like the chin jab that would cripple an opponent in hand-to-hand combat. Trainees practiced escape techniques to use when approached from any direction and how to disarm an enemy. They were also taught how to aid a comrade in trouble. In the classroom, trainees studied enemy propaganda, photography, demolition, and cross-country reconnaissance. The secluded property in Maryland that later became Camp David was used to train OSS officers for service in Europe. The Jedburghs were paramilitary units who operated in France, Belgium, and Holland and worked alongside the local resistance. In addition to their physical training and familiarization with the conditions they would encounter on the ground in Europe, Jedburghs learned French and other languages, as well as how to read maps and compasses and how to use ciphers. They became expert nighttime navigators, parachutists, and radio communicators. These units were also trained to use special weapons, a favorite being the Sten gun. This small submachine gun, nicknamed a pipe and bed spring, had three important advantages. It was inexpensive to produce, simple to dismantle, and easy to conceal. The training process to become an OSS officer was not easy or conventional. With the outbreak of World War II, President Roosevelt looked to new techniques to take the fight to the enemy. OSS training did the trick.
That's cool. That's cool. So, people ask me, oh, just 1 minute. I'm going to put her in the kitchen. Come on, Dixie. Where were you? Well, that's part of being what in my opening monologue, I mentioned how I like to be around dogs, and that's normal for me. But wow, people ask me, well, what can we believe about history? What parts of history do we believe? Well, I believe that part of history, that in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, up to the Kennedy assassination, there was some shenanigans going on, and that's where they figured, hey, back then, people knew that the winners of the war rewrite the history, and I'm sure that people were going like, hey, remember that whole thing that we can rewrite history? Well, it looks like they did it. Yeah, we want to say good evening to you. Good morning, whenever anybody watches this. Glad you could be here. Thank you so much. So let's get back to the Office of Strategic Service. Boy, that was a good one, huh? You don't usually get them that cool. So here is the staunch Roman Catholic who, worked for only $1 a year just to be there to help, got himself in charge. He's the one that hired all those actors and everybody else that they were just talking about. Here's all their star forts, the cities, star fort cities that they had in China, still there. Look at that ruffian, First Lieutenant George Muslin. Ooh, he's behind enemy lines in German-occupied Serbia as a Sitnik during his first mission. He's got his picture of his first mission there, like his first day going to kindergarten there. His second operation was Operation Helyard. I'm sure that's pretty interesting. Maybe we could drop in on it later. So now, which is this? This is that Crisis in American Youth from the Ronald Reagan Library. Let's get a little look at what they, what was going down, because this was propaganda for my parents on why they thought, man, because my dad was into raising, my dad ran a pretty tight ship. I don't know nothing, and I don't want to get into too much details, but nothing could have prepared me for into being in the ministry as long as I've had, of people that their parents abused them. And it seemed like what was normal for my dad was to build his whole life and take us to the farm so that there'd be no chance for people, no friendly uncles that want to take us for a walk and abuse us. That was not going to happen. And my dad raised me to think that's normal, and I was shocked to find out how unnormal it became or is in this day, or was back then. But it doesn't mean it's not what we should normally ascribe for. But my dad watched these films. He was into this. This is what worked him up to make, and where I'm going with this is that this John Birch, leading to this and that, it's the same thing, because it all led to the same conspiracies that QAnon did. John Birch was the new introduction by the Koch brothers with the money that they brought to the party, because basically, you can trace the John Birch Society and that same money to the founding of the Tea Party. It doesn't mean that the liberals are right about anything, but it doesn't mean that these guys aren't working both sides against us. That's what's true.
Now to Paris. Here another communist-incited student riot, and Khrushchev declared, quote, "We do not want war, but we do not renounce class warfare." Moscow to Cuba. Another proud accomplishment of communism. In Stalin's words, quote, "Lenin never regarded the Republic of Soviets as an end in itself. To him, it was always a link needed to facilitate the victory of the working people of the world over capitalism." Moscow to New York. The United Nations. This happened. Why? Let us ponder the words of Lenin, one of the founders of communism. Quote, "It is possible to conquer the more powerful enemy by skillfully taking advantage of every antagonism between the various groups or types, by taking advantage of every opportunity of gaining a mass ally. Those who do not understand this fail to understand even a grain of Marxism." Youth will decide the issue of the entire struggle, both student youth and still more the working class youth. A further enlightening statement of Lenin's is, quote, In our struggle for world domination, America will fall like a ripe plum without a shot being fired. These are the teachings of Lenin. Quote, at the basis of communist morality lies the struggle for the consolidation and consummation of communism. That also is the basis of communist training, education, and tuition. Stalin, furthering the Marxist-Lenin world domination theme.
You guys, I just wanted you to know if there's a couple of people here. You do know that the name Joseph Stalin is his stage name. It means Joe Steele. It's not his real name. He really was playing a part, and they didn't care because, they study the demographics and they taglines that work. And Joe Steele going to lead us to victory. Okay, sure.
He reminded the communist youth of the world, and I quote, an internationalist is he who is ready to defend the USSR, because the USSR is the base of the world revolutionary movement, unquote. Here is another quote from Stalin, quote, a revolution which has been victorious in one country must regard itself as a means for hastening the victory of the proletariat in all countries. Khrushchev is doing all he can to bury us and achieve in his time the communist world domination goal. On March 21st, 1961, Mr. K told the Soviet people, quote, we shall be happy when the people of all countries stand under the banner of Marxism and Leninism, and the communist banner shall fly over the whole planet, unquote. His militant ally, Chinese Communist Mao Zedong, is quoted in the official Peking People's Daily as saying that coexistence with capitalism is impossible, and that warfare with those forces is inevitable. It would appear that whether hot or cold, the war against our society continues unrelenting.
Khrushchev's happiness depends upon the political theory that the present form of government in the United States should be changed by force, violence, and other unconstitutional means to a totalitarian form of government, where we have a dictatorship. This is what Khrushchev advocates for us and our grandchildren. One-party government. People ruled by dictators and bureaus and not responsible to the people. Controlled by...
Let's go back and look at a couple of their signs there.
People ruled by...
Grain to be delivered at depot must. Well, I mean, that seems like a mandate. Goods at government stores may be purchased. Well, we already got all this stuff. Is that, I mean, two parties, one party, what does it matter if those same two parties fight whether or not life begins at conception and they can't figure that out? They're working together. Let's jump ahead and see what these yahoos are saying about, this is what the propaganda that wasn't that long ago.
Bears this out in a speech at the 40th anniversary of the Komsomol, Young Communist League, quoting Khrushchev. Young people often wonder what a person in communist society should be like. This can be answered briefly. He should be a true Leninist. One is born in a socialist society, and one lives first of all for the community. Therefore, private affairs, thoughts, and deeds must be subordinated. In this communist-sponsored rally, youth is gathered from all over the globe.
In contrast to the rigid control the Russians exercise over their students and youth, ours enjoy liberty and freedom of thought, freedom of choice, and freedom of self-determination. What do our students really know about the basic freedoms and opportunities of the American way of life? For a shocking report on how we look to our enemy, here is Dr. William E. Mayer, Major in the United States Army, foremost authority on communist brainwashing, and a top psychiatrist.
So this ought to be pretty good. He's a foremost expert on brainwashing.
I'm going to read excerpts of a report which is an evaluation of the nature of the average American soldier, as seen by the Chief of Intelligence of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army in North Korea several years ago. I quote, Based upon our observations of American soldiers and their officers captured in this war for the liberation of Korea from capitalist imperialist aggression, the following facts are evident. There is little knowledge or understanding, even among U.S. university graduates, of American political history or philosophy, the federal, state, and community organization, states and civil rights, freedoms, safeguards, checks and balances, and how these things allegedly operate within his own system. The American is insular and provincial, with little or no idea of the problems and the aims of what he contemptuously describes as foreigners and their countries. The American soldier has weak loyalties to his family, his community, his country, his religion, and to his fellow soldier. His concepts of right and wrong are hazy and ill-formed. Opportunism is easy for him. By himself, he feels frightened and insecure. He underestimates his own worth, his own strength, and his ability to survive. He is ignorant of social values, social tensions, and conflicts. That's the end of the quotation. There are several important things that should be remembered about this document. To begin with, it was written by communists. It reflects their point of view. It was not written as propaganda, but as a guide for those people who were going to operate prisoner of war camps in North Korea. The studies were of soldiers under the worst possible conditions of malnutrition and danger. Now, we have studied.
Now, remember, at this point, I want to remind you that I've been saying for a couple of years that during the Korean War, when they took these people, so many prisoners, because it was a mass defeat for the United Nations. That's how come you don't hear about the mass defeat for the United States. They credit it against the United Nations. And that's where the Manchurian candidates came from. There are people that they had brainwashed and put in power that in ways that we can't even imagine. And that's what he's trying to explain away, why some people were weak and talked bad about the America. And now they were going to come up with a new way to make sure that all of their new ethnically orphan trained people that they're releasing into the public now to take over after the war get educated properly. That's what's going on here.
In the armed forces ever since that time, the nature of the American soldier and ways to improve his quality. And we've come a long way. Recent research in the past year has indicated that the average American fighting man is today more concerned with his duties and responsibilities, both as a soldier and as a citizen, and is better informed about communism than ever before. However, the document still has a certain amount of meaning and importance for Americans. It can serve as a kind of checklist that we can use ourselves. By seeing what it is the communists feel are our greatest vulnerabilities, the big chinks and cracks in our moral armor, we can determine or attempt to whether our family structure today, whether our school system, our churches, the activities of our communities are actually building in to young Americans long before they reach military age, are building in those attributes of a sense of deep personal responsibility, not leaving things to somebody else or to the government to take care of for them. Whether our society is building into our youngsters a genuine, deep understanding of the philosophical basis for this society of free men, the moral basis upon which our country is founded and upon which the preservation of a society such as ours depends.
Here is how the freedom and prosperity we enjoy came about.
Wow. Before we hear that, isn't it just amazing to see how the military cares so much for us? and that, you know, they were going to explain it all. And this, you know, now that we get our mind right, that we're the ones that we should be willing to just fight and die for them because everything we've done is correct. No, I think it's time to stop the fighting. Stop all the fighting. Stop fighting. Here's what the good guys do. You get a debt, you pay it off, and you live happily ever after.
Private property, a natural human right. Private property in the United States guaranteed by the Constitution and laws. Private ownership of land and the means of production. The right to pay interest and dividends for the use of money in order to conduct a business. The right to sell legal stocks and bonds to finance business. People free to organize and conduct any legal business for profit. Our system stimulates initiative, industry, creativity, and independence. And it develops the natural resources of the nation. And ensures large production of goods and services and employment to many people. In the face of what we have to offer, how do communists gain control of non-communist governments? Let's take a look. By military occupation. By expelling non-communist officials. By the army appointing puppet officials. By obtaining military and police powers. Controlling the legislative procedures.
You know, this sounds a lot like what, you know, people are mad about in our country today and why they got sucked into the QAnon, where it was finally cool again and okay to admit there were conspiracies until they said, no, quit believing in conspiracies. Interesting.
By propaganda creating political and economic unrest. Controlling the courts. Terrorizing political and economic opponents. By obtaining government positions and secrets. Khrushchev uttered these words: "We respect all peoples and are in favor of each settling for itself, which order is better for it."
This is Budapest, Hungary, October 1956. University students are demonstrating their approval of Poland's successful defiance of the Soviet Union. Their ranks quickly swelled with public support. They assembled in the tens of thousands to hear members of their writers' union oppose the Communist Party government leaders for oppressing freedom, distorting the truth, exploiting labor, and abusing the farmers. The students demand an end to Soviet domination. They want their own flag without the Soviet empire.
Look at that guy getting pretty dangerous with that knife.
The symbol of alien rule. Khrushchev had this to say, quote, "The lesson of the events in Hungary where the counter-revolution used some writers for its filthy ends reminds us of what political carelessness can lead to in relation to the intrigues of the forces hostile to socialism," unquote. The students post their own program of 16 points, including a demand for a new government to resist Soviet oppression. They marched to the Budapest radio station to make their program known to the nation and to the world. Their delegates are arrested.
You know, you have to keep in mind, these are orphan-trained children, just like your grandparents were orphan-trained children's. I mean, let's look at, you know, well, here's our world today, you know. Well, oh my goodness. Tornadoes everywhere. Workers trapped in an Amazon warehouse. Someone's church is totally gone. It was a rare December tornado outbreak. Twisters ripped through the heartland. 100 feared dead. 227 miles of destruction. You know, that's not going to help. You know, since we're not communism, we don't have a first lady or a vice president who needs some serious help, you know. Supreme Court, after 50 years, is finally closing in and going to see if life begins at conception. taxes are collected. We got Ghislaine Maxwell, you know, in the news saying Epstein's murdered. What's new? You know, shaky business practices everywhere. Inflation highest since 1982. Wow, sticker shock. Brian Williams thinks he still has something to say. Omicron surge is a warning to the rest of the world. Proof we all need a boost. That's their royal family, you know, because a lot of countries still have those royal families here. Whistleblowers, you know, they're good in other countries, but not if they are from against the United States and say, hey, the United States is spying on. They even have Andrea Merkel's phone tapped. She got over it, but America's mad at this guy. They want to kill him. Oh, and Musk is thinking of quitting something. He looks fed up. I should just take all my money and my brains and just stop helping America. Nobody cares about Elon Musk anymore. So anyway, we got, you know, photo opportunities and fake mode everywhere. Give me a break. We got Depeche Mode probably still looking for his own personal Jesus because the one in the Bible wasn't good enough for him. Who's this? Oh, that's that one there. And what's this? Who is the John Birch? Let's get a little more, see if we can get anything fresh on him here. I want to use a Creative Commons if there are any. Though it really drops down. That's the one we just were watching. Cast register, that comes up under John Birch. This ought to be good.
In 1943, the following directive was issued from party headquarters to all communists in the United States. It read, when certain obstructionists become too irritating, label them after suitable buildups as fascist or Nazi or anti-Semitic, and use the prestige of anti-fascist and tolerance organizations to discredit them. In the public mind, constantly associate those who oppose us with those names which already have a bad smell. The association will, after enough repetition, become fact in the public mind.
Well, there's not much new about that, but that is one of the, I guess, what do you say, the legends of, you know, the right wing. Who was this mystery man, John Birch? United States Army Air Force Military Intelligence Captain, OSS agent during the China part of World War II, as well as a former Baptist minister and missionary. He was killed in a confrontation with Chinese communist soldiers during an assignment he was ordered on by the OSS. 10 days after the war ended, that's why he's called the first martyr of the Third World War, or the first martyr of the Cold War. Posthumously awarded the Army Distinguished Service Medal. Birch was well known throughout China, and the Chinese gave him the name Beishangui, Birch Captain. He also was known by the Chinese communists who killed him after the war was over, who he believed had done very little to oppose the Japanese in China during the war. They were counting on Chiang Kai-shek to do all the fighting against Japan until Soviet came in and saved the day. The John Birch Society was founded in 1958 by one Robert H.W. Welch. Welch considered Birch to be a martyr and the first casualty of the Cold War. My, oh my, Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to members of the OSS in recognition of their superior and major contributions during the war. We saw that. That was all those famous, where if you were an actor, they'd get you a job in the OSS. Or if you were a gay baseball player like that guy, Mo, you know, oh yeah, we got some people over there that want to talk to you. Let's see. John Birch brought charges of heresies against some professors for holding to the theory of evolution. How about that? My goodness. So his missionary work, he was, after college, he enrolled in J. Frank Norris Fundamental Bible Baptist Institute in Fort Worth, Texas. Completed the 2-year curriculum in 1 year at the head of his class. Was really, from what they say, he was working for the return of the Lord. That's what he wanted. And so these guys were all famous. These flying tigers, they had those famous paintings on the front of their fighter airplanes. He was helping those guys fight the Japanese. He really felt bad, or the people. We have no idea in our normal lives. Nothing could prepare us for how betrayed they felt when the communists were helped by the United States and the nationalists got pushed onto Taiwan. That still divides the FBI and the CIA to this day. And, we're not going to be able to let that all wash over us in one night. But tying in Asia, as we've done, the last couple of days with Islam, and how, to me, it's really something that, that could have been Tartaria, the invention of Mohammedism, that after the reaping or whatever, when Satan's loosed it, they just flipped a couple of apocryphal books about Christianity and turned it into Mohammedism. It seems like the dates and everything else are just, begging for that. Now, I saw one other video that I really think that it should be okay to see. I have, he's a little bit dry, but, it moves along pretty good. So I think we're going to start it about in here.
Polygram of this age, a guy named Frank Norris, who was known as the Gospel of Dynamite Preacher and the Fighting Fundamentalist. And Norris had a small mission in China, and Birch decided early in his life that he wanted to be a missionary. And when he met Frank Norris, he knew that he wanted to go to China. And so he ended up in China with his one of the other graduates from this Bible college, Oscar Wells, who is on your left. Birch is on the right. Here they are, dressed in their white suits with their white shoes and their white pith helmets. You would never know from looking at this picture that there was a war going on outside of the city of Shanghai. The Chinese had been at war with Japan for three years, a bitter, bloody war, and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives by this time had already been lost. But looking at this picture, you would feel that they would be oblivious to this. They were aware of the war, but they were still so dedicated and so committed to being missionaries. And as young men are wont to do, looking for adventure, wanting to kind of see what was out in the world, that they went ahead. They were full of idealism, and they were totally unprepared. So the first thing that they had to do was to learn some Chinese language. And here they are with a congregation in Shanghai. This is Birch and Wells in the middle there. And these were the kind of pictures that were taken to show the folks back home how well you were doing. So Birch actually was quite effective, quite adept at learning language, and he had some respect for Chinese culture. He was not like some missionaries who kind of walled themselves off and isolated themselves from Chinese society. He really jumped right into it. And after doing some language work in Shanghai, he moved down to Hangzhou, where he was teaching in a boys' school. Hangzhou had already been occupied by the Japanese, and so he saw what was going on there. He saw the devastation in the city of Hangzhou, and he decided, after he had been in China for a year, to move beyond Japanese lines to the town of the city of Shangrao in Jiangxi province. And he went there. He was the only Westerner in that area, and so he was quite independent. And in Shangrao for several months, he was not doing well. He was received well by the Chinese. They were happy to have him, and they knew that the Americans were helping to fight against the Japanese.
See what I mean by, you know, this is a superfluous information, but it's still, overall, this is a great video. Stay with it, please.
Japanese. But he was surviving on a very limited diet. He was suffering from malaria, and he was not getting any checks from home, from his home mission. They just weren't getting through. And so after Pearl Harbor, in December of 1941, the Japanese surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, Birch volunteered for the U.S. Army in China. And by coincidence, just as he was traveling in Zhejiang province, near the city of Chuzhou, the Americans, led by General Jimmy Doolittle, this is a raid on Japan.
Now, who thinks this was a coincidence? I don't. But they used it, you know, it's all written from the beginning. Something happened. This was the start of the Tea Party, people, please.
The surprise attack in April of 1942. And this came as a complete shock to the Japanese, who were totally unprepared for it. It was a tremendous boost to American morale because it proved that the Japanese home islands were vulnerable. But the planes that were supposed to land in China, for a number of reasons, didn't make it. The pilots had to bail out, most of them over Zhejiang province. And John Birch, he's not in this photo, but this is Jimmy Doolittle himself with members of his crew and some of the Chinese in eastern Zhejiang province. Jimmy Doolittle, after this photo was taken, was rendezvousing with his other airmen. There were 80 of them from 16 planes altogether. And they were alongside a river, and a Chinese gentleman came up to John Birch, who was having lunch there in a local restaurant. And he said, "You see that boat down by the river?" He said, "There are Americans in that boat." Birch goes down. He says, "This is not possible. Americans here, kind of in the middle of nowhere." Knocks on the door. "Are there any Americans in there?" Door opens. There's Doolittle and the other 4 members of his crew. So
can't you just kind of imagine Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones doing that part in a movie? "Hey, are there any Americans in there?" "Yeah." "Well, I'm a former missionary spy that's just the man that can help you." What a coincidence.
Doolittle invites Birch to come along with him and to help him out. Birch, speaks Chinese language, knows the territory, kind of leads him to where he's going. And this is this is Birch's introduction to the U.S. military, and it becomes a claim to fame. Robert Welch later will write that John Birch was responsible for the rescue of the Doolittle Raiders. John Birch never would have made this claim. He was far too modest. But this is the way in which, one small example of how his life becomes distorted, becomes misrepresented by Welch subsequently. Birch, who is on the right here, had a smooth transition into the Army. He expected to be a chaplain, which was natural given his background. And after getting to know something about the military, he very much wanted to be a pilot. He had I'll read just a little bit here. The transition to soldier's life occurred with remarkable ease. In his mind, there was no contradiction between his former life as an evangelist and joining the Army. No need to reject or deny his past. He had substituted one all-consuming passion for another, a battle against a different form of evil, a tyranny that happened to be temporal instead of spiritual. He quite naturally expected to be a chaplain, as I mentioned, which would afford the double opportunity to serve God and country. Little did he imagine that he was about to assume an entirely new identity, not as a preacher, but as an intelligence officer. Claire Chennault, who was the famous commander of the Flying Tigers in China that then becomes the 14th Air Force, was recruiting young Americans like John Birch, who knew the language, knew the territory, could live in the field with Chinese armies, could eat Chinese food, which wasn't, that wasn't in those days, Chinese food, the Chinese armies were living on subsistence rations in many cases, so that wasn't unimportant. And Birch was very effective in his working as the first field liaison officer for Chennault and the 14th Air Force. He won a Legion of Merit, and here he is being decorated by Chennault in 1943. And he was very close to Chennault, who after the death of John Birch said that Birch had been like a son to him. People were quite drawn to Birch, they were quite attracted to him. The rogue in the upper middle, in the center, is a guy named Arthur Hopkins, who had been with the Yale in China program, who knew Birch. He said Birch had an amazing grasp of the Chinese language and understood the people. He was absolutely fearless, completely unselfish, never thinking of his personal discomfort or danger. And here on the right, we have Ernie Johnson, who was a B-25 tail gunner. And he got to know Birch later in the war as well. He said Birch was not a bigot. He was not a political person. He said while Birch did not drink, smoke, or sleep with women, he also did not self-righteously criticize those who did. Birch was straight and narrow in terms of his Christian beliefs, but he was very open-minded in other ways, and I think he grew up.
That made no sense to me at all. How is that being open-minded or something? It's like you're not. So I'm not sure. They're just rewriting John Birch or whoever he really was or whatever. But I just don't like that kind of talk.
Matured considerably through the course of the war. He also, when he was in college and Bible school, Bible Institute.
Well, we don't need to hear it. He had a couple of girlfriends.
To date, having grown up in Georgia. So Birch led these field liaison radio intelligence teams. His job was to coordinate, and here he is a little bit later in the war. You see the captain's bars on his collar here. And his job was to coordinate with U.S. pilots and to radio information to them, to recruit Chinese agents, to provide weather reports, which was quite important in those days. You didn't have satellites and GPS to tell you what the weather was, 100 miles away, or what it was going to be tomorrow even. Gather intelligence information on the enemy and to rescue downed American pilots. The Chinese nationalists they had a small air force, but it had been devastated early in the war. And so there were some Chinese pilots as well that he was involved with. And towards the end of the war, Birch, as the Japanese were losing in the Pacific, as the U.S. strategy to move across the Pacific was taking its toll, the Japanese were retreating from South China to North China. You'll know that the nationalist Chinese had retreated to the southwest of China. In 1935, the communists had been pushed up to Yan'an during the Long March, and the Japanese controlled the area to the east of the dotted line here, as well as Hong Kong and Guangzhou. So they actually basically had an embargo on the entire seaboard of China, which made it very difficult for the Americans to get supplies. And the supplies had to come in from India over the Himalayas, what was known as the hump. And so Birch was working in the north of China at this point. He had worked with, or did work with, the Chinese communists on a number of occasions. I think it's worth noting that he had no affinity for either the nationalists or the communists, no sympathy for either one. His sympathies lay with the Chinese people. And towards the end of the war, in August of 1945, this is a photo that was taken about 2 weeks before his death. Here he is with a Chinese general. He was sent on a final mission just 10 days, this is just days, literally days after the surrender of the Japanese in August of 1945. The surrender was August 15. Let me read another small excerpt. He wrote to Marjorie Tooker, when the first wild thrill swept through this little river town where I was last night, as the Chongqing radio said Japan was trying to surrender, I realized for the first time how utterly weary, even heartsick, this war has made me. The same mixture of excitement, exhaustion, and relief marked the U.S. effort in general. Almost no one could imagine that a horrendous civil war would result in a communist victory within the next 4 years. So Birch,
and remember, that's when the United States, through the United Nations, said we got to go in and get Korea. There's still something going on there too. That's armistice, just like World War I ended in armistice.
Emotionally and physically was spent. He was ready to go home. He had declined a 45-day leave to go back to the United States. He said, no, I want to see the war through. I want to stay through the end of this. And so he was sent on a final mission to gather intelligence in the city of Suzhou, up here in the northern part of Jiangsu province. And he started from this R2S base, that's where that photo was taken, and made his way up river and then by rail with a small team of 3 Americans, 10 Chinese, these would have been nationalist, Kuomintang, and 2 Koreans. Many of the Koreans were fluent in Japanese, so they would have been interpreters, right? And they encountered along the way a Chinese communist detachment near the town of Huangkou, a small village, small town, walled village. And the Chinese communists had been fighting Japanese in this area. They ordered Birch to surrender his arm and his companions and others in his team, ordered them to be disarmed. This was a standing order from the Chinese communist commanders, Juda, back in Yan'an. If you encounter any strangers, any outsiders, you must detain them and disarm them. And Birch refused. He resented this order. He said, what are you trying to do? We just won the war. We Americans just won the war. How dare you try to disarm me?
Well, see, and that's the thing. The Americans didn't win the war. The Russians won the war. It was their major offensive that won the war and ended it. 1 month after a treaty that they wouldn't go to war against Japan for after Germany was defeated for a month, and they did it to the day. If I'm remembering correctly, it's something like that, I'm sure.
What are you, bandits? Gongfei? And so he was insulting the Chinese. And things got out of hand. Tempers flared. One thing led to another. Birch was shot and killed. The other members of his team were taken prisoner and eventually made it all the way to Yan'an. It took several weeks for them to get there. When they arrived in Yan'an, they were flown down to Chongqing and then back to the United States to be debriefed. But the body of Birch was left in Huangkou. News of this incident reached the city of Suzhou. The nationalist Chinese have not yet arrived here. And so the Japanese and the Chinese puppet forces, these are Chinese who have been fighting for the Japanese, arranged to bring the body back to Suzhou. And just about that time, a young American who had known Birch back at the Anhui base realized what had happened and arranged for a funeral.
And before he tells you, he'll just mention this Roman Catholic, that John Birch was buried in a Roman Catholic cemetery. And basically the John Birch Society and the CIA is known as Catholics in America. It is basically their mother church that they get back to. And even the logo is Ad Morium Dejorium for the Jesuits and for Christian Liberty, which became the John Birch, largest homeschool supply, because to teach, yay America at any cost.
Here is Lieutenant William Miller, who has only been in China for a year or so, with a Catholic priest who has been in Suzhou through the course of the war. I think he's either Italian or Austrian, at the funeral site of John Birch. And this was a remarkable funeral. Birch was a dyed-in-the-wool Baptist. Funeral was held in a Catholic church, which is still standing. My wife Ellen and I visited Suzhou. We met with the priests there. He had no records from this period. I think they had all been destroyed somewhere along the line, maybe during the Cultural Revolution, maybe during the Korean War. But the funeral and the burial was attended by high-ranking Japanese officers who had just surrendered, a Japanese general, as well as these Chinese puppet troops. And here they are. And what strange bedfellows. And yet, because this was an American soldier, an American officer, they thought, well, this is something we should pay attention to. A little bit more on that later. And this is a photo that I received after the publication of my book from the nephew of one of the men who was buried alongside of Birch. There were two American pilots, one by the name of Samuel Evans and the other Donald Davidson on the left and the right of Birch, who was buried in the middle. And there's no evidence of these graves at this time. They've long since been removed. But Birch's family, his mother, and the others as well, I've learned that they declined to have the remains brought back to the United States. So I was not successful in finding out what actually had happened to the remains. My guess is that during the anti-American campaigns at the time of the Korean War in the early 1950s, these graves, which were really, as you can see, would have been temporary, they were just bricks, that they would have been removed. This gravesite is on a hillside. It's called Yunlongshan, Cloud Dragon Mountain. just on the outskirts of Suzhou. And today it's a heavily forested public park. It's really quite beautiful, quite lovely. Well, that might have been the end of the story. We might not be talking about John Birch today, except for the fact that General Wedemeyer, Albert Wedemeyer, who was commander of the U.S. forces in China at this time, back in Chongqing, got the news of the death of an American officer and the detention of another OSS mission further north in China, even before the death of Birch, and the fact that the men with Birch, the 33 Americans, had been taken prisoner. And so he was quite concerned. What did this mean? Was this a signal that Chinese Communist policy, which had been really quite open to cooperation with the United States, was this a signal from Mao that the policy was changing? Was something in the wind shifting? American policy at this point is to remain neutral, if at all possible, and to avoid getting entangled in the Chinese Civil War, and to avoid civil war in the first place, if possible. Well, this is one of the great ironies, one of the great coincidences of history. This is what makes history so fascinating. Mao Zedong had just been flown down from Yan'an to Chongqing for peace talks with Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Chinese nationalists. And it's Mao's first time on an airplane. And you sort of get that feeling from looking at this photo. It looks like a slight state of shock. And Hurley, of course, was a very controversial figure, very bombastic. There are those who said towards the end of his ambassadorship, he was growing senile. He was a wealthy businessman. He had been a trusted confidant of Franklin Roosevelt, but that's a different story. In any case, Wedemeyer arranges for...
Just by saying that guy was a trusted confidant of FDR is saying, and I haven't checked for a while to make sure I'm still streaming, that's basically saying, he's a communist too, because that's what FDR basically was.
For a meeting with Mao at the home of Ambassador Hurley on the evening of August 30, 1945, literally 5 days after the death of John Birch. And Wedemeyer says, Mr. Mao, and there's a 4 or 5 page transcript of this conversation. So this is a literal conversation. Mr. Mao, I have learned that an American officer has been shot and killed by your forces in the north of China. We cannot let this happen. And Mao says, if this is true, it must have been a mistake. I apologize if this actually is the case, but I know nothing about this. And I think it's quite honest on Mao's part that he was uninformed about this. Radio communications at this point were pretty basic, and Mao, I don't think, would have had this information. But Wedemeyer is essentially lecturing Mao. Zhou Enlai is in this meeting as well. Zhou has spent most of the time representing the Chinese communists in Chongqing during the war. And Zhou says, and Wedemeyer says, we need to be able to send American forces anywhere at any time without prior notification. Zhou Enlai says, you mean anywhere? And Wedemeyer says, yeah, anywhere. This is our kind of our right to do this. And so Mao goes away.
And this was in only 2017. And doesn't America feel like would he feel that confident expressing, the universal, that it's normal to think that the United States is the only world power? How quickly we forget.
Away from this meeting, feeling quite humiliated and quite angry. And nonetheless, the standing order on the part of the communists to detain and to disarm any Americans is reversed. And the Chinese communists say we must treat the Americans with great care. We must be very sensitive because we don't want to have them backing the nationalists any more than they already are. And we must avoid any future Birch incidents. That's basically what it amounts to. So this is really quite a dramatic confrontation, and in some ways it's the beginning of the end of any possibility of cooperation between the US and the CCP. Wiedemeyer called it a very serious and very grave incident. Well, again, there was so much going on in the world at the end of the war, in the beginning of the Cold War.
Yeah, they were faking the atomic bombs, faking quantum physics, faking the merger of Operation Paperclip just to fund NASA and DARPA, all working. Yeah, so things were busy there. Get to your point, Dr. Terry Lautz.
This would have been a footnote. Nobody would have paid much attention to this, although Wiedemeyer did launch a very, very detailed investigation of the death of John Birch to determine who was responsible. And
here's where things get crazy, because we're expected to believe he's just happened to be reading some ancient, 3-year-old congressional records, stumbled on his speech and said, I've got to make this guy a hero. His mommy, John Birch's mommy, says, yeah, they told me he was just, killed by accidental stray bullets. It's let's fund the Tea Party.
Again, we have another twist of history. Senator William Nolan, heir to the Oakland Tribune fortune, California senator, stood up on the dais of the U.S. Senate after the outbreak of the Korean War, but before the Chinese entered the war in October. And he said, quote briefly here, he told the simple story of a lone American officer, and here I'm quoting from Nolan, who was willing to sacrifice his life so that this nation might find out whether these communists were friends or enemies. The incident, claimed Nolan, was one of the least known and most significant indications of communist intentions in China. So essentially, Nolan is rewriting history. He's saying the communists were not the friends. They were not cooperating. They were cooperating with us, but they were really wolves in sheep's clothing. They were really pretending to be friendly to the U.S. And John Birch realized this before anybody else. Robert Welch goes on to claim that John Birch martyred himself to show the world, to show Americans that indeed the communists were real enemies, just as they became during the Korean War. So you have a complete distortion of the past, a complete, an astounding claim that history would have been different had Americans only realized that the communists were actually enemies rather than friends of the United States. Robert Welch happened upon Nolan's speech in the Congressional Record. The speech at the time in 1950 did not get much attention, but Welch was reading through the Congressional Record. If you can imagine that, if you've ever read the Congressional Record, it's very small print, it's very dense, and it's just speech after speech of what any congressman or senator wants to put in the record. And Welch read this speech 3 years later, and he decided that John Birch was the ideal symbol for this new movement, this new advocacy group. He went to Birch's parents, he told them, and here are the parents on the left with in Texas at a memorial service with Frank Norris, the preacher from Fort Worth, Texas. memorial service for their son just after the war. And Welch said to the parents that their son was a great patriot, compared him to Nathan Hale, the Revolutionary War hero, hanged by the British, who had sacrificed his life.
And regretted that he only had one life to sacrifice.
Welch never met John Birch. Welch never set foot in China, although he did visit Taiwan and Korea. But John Birch's parents were angry, and they had become convinced that there had been a conspiracy to cover up their son's death. They felt that he had not received the recognition that he deserved. The mother, in particular, had decided that this story should be told, and she became thoroughly convinced. This is just at the point when McCarthy is rising to power. She became thoroughly convinced that indeed there had been a conspiracy to cover up the death. Now, the files, the investigation of Birch's death were kept secret. They were top secret because they were OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the forerunner of the CIA. And these files were kept secret until 1972, just after they were released, just after Nixon's trip to China in February of 1972. But Ethel Birch, the mother, had been told that her son had been killed by stray bullets on a railway in North China. Well, this certainly was not the case. And here she is with her daughter and her husband and 4 of the other sons, and a picture of John. And she agreed to Robert Welch's request to use her son's name. Welch wrote a hagiography of Birch, calling him a heroic young patriot who recognized the dangers of communism long before anybody else. He said Birch's death was a deliberate and unjustified killing, and claimed that, again, Birch had sacrificed his life as a warning to others about the true intentions of the communists. So the Birch Society was founded in 1958. This is 13 years after the death of John Birch. Here you see the logo: less government, more responsibility, with God's help, a better world. John Birch, American hero, founder Robert Welch. So if you join the Birch Society, this is the membership card that you would get. And I think Welch had decided that John Birch was the ideal symbol, the ideal kind of poster boy for his cause for 3 reasons. One, Birch was a legitimate hero. He was a fine young American. He was he'd been both a missionary and a soldier. Secondly, of course, he had been a martyr. He was described as the first casualty of World War III, the first casualty of the Cold War. These were William Nolan's words. And then third, of course, was the conspiracy that Welch believed there was to cover up the death of John Birch. So Welch believed the story of Birch would inspire and instruct Americans about communism and about conspiracy. I think it had exactly the opposite effect in many ways. Birch's odyssey was cut short when he was only 27 years old. He would not live.
Now, is that the age that those rock stars die at, 27? Because I couldn't remember if it was 27 or 28. Help me out there in the comments if you can.
To marry and have children, nor would he fulfill his ambition to remain in China as a missionary. His personal joys and failures, his loves and disappointments, his self-assurance and private doubts, his victories and defeats, all had come to naught. With the founding of the John Birch Society, his memory became irrevocably intertwined with right-wing American politics. The anxieties of the Cold War masked and distorted this young man rather than revealing him. No longer was he an authentic American hero, a man of irrefutable purity and character and nobility of purpose. Those are the words of Robert Welch. Instead of being honored for the dedication of his faith and service to his country, the real John Birch became a mirage, much like the American dream for China, shimmering in the distance, always just beyond reach. So this, I think, is a cautionary tale. It is something of an allegory, if you will, for U.S.-China relations. It certainly reflects the confusion and the uncertainty and the dismay about what happened in China with the communist victory in 1949. The hope was that China would be a strong ally of the United States. It would be democratic. It would be a strong partner. This was the vision of Franklin Roosevelt during the war. When things didn't work out that way, China was rejected, and Birch becomes a symbol of that. So let me leave it there and invite your questions. Again, thank you so much for being here.
And so that wasn't, he didn't get into a chance, but the new and some of the original founders of the John Birch Society, they were the Kochs, the Fred Koch and his, the sons that founded the Tea Party. And they were the ones that, eventually that somehow led to QAnon and the releasing of all of the conspiracies. Well, all the conspiracies except Flat Earth and Mudflood was Armageddon, the important ones. They finally got a group of people. And so, I'm going to leave it there and see how we're going to tie this in later with everything about, the departing of Asia. But let's see if there's anything there's something right on the tip of my tongue, but I just can't think of it right now. But anyway, we'll have a lot to learn about China, Asia, the falling away, the Bible. I keep this one nice and short, something that people can watch. I want to thank you guys for sticking with it. Thank you there, Fractal Dust Bear. Appreciate it so much. Luther, Stellar Twang, people that have commented. I've known that people have been coming in and out, but it's a show about doing what we normally are going to do. And if they ever say that there's going to be a new normal, what does that even really mean? Normal for who? Normal for how they want us to be at that time? I know how God normally wants us to be, living in submission to his Bible, presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice to him. So thank you for tuning in. More on John Birch coming soon. So Flat Earth Nation, Mudflood was Armageddon. I'm never going to tell you anything else. Why would I? I'm trying to prove that I have your best interest at heart. Amen. Hallelujah. Aho.